Have you ever wanted to, build an empire? Like start from nothing and grow into something truly massive? Well, today we're looking at a game that seems to be all about that. It's called Imperium Sine Fine.
Yeah, and from the looks of the documentation, it's this interesting mix of like big picture strategy and real-time action, kind of combining those grand strategy elements with the empire building and unit control of an RTS.
So maybe we should back up a second for anyone listening who's not super familiar with those terms. What exactly do we mean when we say grand strategy in the context of games?
Well, in a grand strategy game, you're usually dealing with managing a huge entity. It could be a nation or, like you said, a whole empire. And you're thinking about things on a really long time scale. It's all about those really big decisions.
Right. Like, where are you going to invest your resources? Do you focus on tech or maybe on building up a strong military? And of course, who are you going to be friends with and who are you going to end up fighting? It's like you're the mastermind behind it all, shaping the destiny of a whole civilization.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you have real-time strategy, or RTS, where things are happening constantly. You're building your base, gathering resources, and sending your units out to fight in real time. It's a lot more about reacting quickly and adapting to what's happening on the fly.
So from what we've seen, Imperium Sine Fine seems to be trying to bring those two worlds together. You're making these big strategic choices about your empire, but you're also actively involved in developing your settlements and commanding your armies in a real-time environment.
Yeah, it's like they're taking the best of both worlds and trying to create something really unique.
And the core idea behind Imperium Sine Fine is that you're leading one of 14 different factions in a fantasy setting. Each faction is unique, with its own strengths and weaknesses. Your goal is to guide your faction to glory, however you define that.
Right, and that means building up your empire, researching new technologies, forming alliances, and waging war when you have to.
Now, just to be clear, we're not going to dive into every single faction today.
Yeah, for this deep dive, we decided to focus on the core mechanics of the game and leave out a few of the races and factions, just to keep things a bit more manageable. So we won't be talking about the Skulk, Lavaro, or Necromancer races today.
Right, and we'll also be skipping over the Umbral Court faction for now. There's still plenty to cover just looking at the core gameplay and the other factions.
Absolutely. There's a lot to unpack here.
So let's start with the factions you can actually play as. In total, there are 14 different factions. Even the free warrior edition of the game gives you access to 13 of them.
That's pretty generous, actually.
Yeah, it is. The Premium Emperor edition unlocks the final faction and includes an extra bonus faction as a way to support the developers.
It sounds like they're really trying to make the game accessible, even for players who don't want to spend any money up front.
Absolutely. And with so many different factions to choose from, there's a lot of replayability built in.
For sure. And I imagine each faction plays quite differently, with its own unique units, technologies, and strategies.
Right. And those differences will really come into play as you engage in the main activities of the game, which we can break down into a few key areas. The first is empire building.
So, like laying the foundation.
Exactly. You need to develop a strong economy to support your expansion, research, and military. It's all about creating that solid base from which to grow.
It's like in any civilization, right? You can't really achieve anything great without a stable and thriving economy.
And that leads into the next key area, which is technology research. This is where you can unlock game-changing advancements that can give you a serious edge over your rivals.
Do we know what kind of technologies we're talking about here?
Well, the documentation mentions a bunch of different areas you can research, things like agriculture to boost your food production, archery to improve your ranged units, construction to build things faster, even diplomacy to help you negotiate better with other factions.
Wow, that's a pretty wide range. It seems like they've really thought about the different aspects of running a civilization.
And it gets even deeper. Most of these technologies have up to 10 levels, so there's a lot of room to specialize and really refine your empire's strengths.
So you can have a faction that's like a technological powerhouse, or one that's focused on military might, or even one that excels at diplomacy and trade.
Exactly. And then you have diplomacy, which is all about interacting with the other factions in the game. You're not just building your empire in isolation. You need to decide who to ally with, who to trade with, and unfortunately, who to go to war with.
I'm guessing it's not always easy to stay on everyone's good side.
Oh, definitely not. The game describes diplomacy as dynamic, meaning that your relationships with other factions are constantly changing based on your actions and theirs.
I bet that leads to some interesting situations, like maybe you have an alliance with one faction, but then they do something that upsets another faction you're friendly with. Suddenly you're caught in the middle.
Exactly. And to make things even more interesting, there's a language barrier at the start of the game.
A language barrier.
Yeah, you can't really communicate with other factions beyond declaring war until you translate their language.
So you might be sitting next to a faction that's about to attack you, but you have no idea because you can't understand what they're saying.
That's right. It adds a whole new layer of strategy to the game, forcing you to think carefully about how you approach those early interactions.
It's almost like a fog of war, but for diplomacy.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have military campaigns, which is where the real-time strategy elements really come into play. You'll be building up your armies, deploying them across the map, and engaging in battles with your rivals.
So it's not all just talking and negotiating.
Oh, definitely not. Sometimes you have to use force to get what you want.
And I imagine that part of the game is pretty intense, with a lot of action and quick decision-making.
Absolutely. And as you conquer new territory, that leads into the final key area, which is territorial expansion. You'll be founding new cities, establishing outposts, and claiming valuable resources to further fuel your empire's growth.
So it's like a constant cycle of building, researching, diplomacy, war, and expansion. Each element feeds into the others, creating a really dynamic and interconnected gameplay experience.
That's a great way to put it. Now let's delve a little deeper into some of these core systems, starting with resources and the economy. What are the building blocks of your empire?
All right, let's talk resources. What do we need to know?
Well, the game has two main types of materials. Resources, which are the raw materials you gather, and equipment, which is crafted from those resources.
Makes sense. So what kind of resources are we talking about?
The basic resources are manpower, horses, iron, leather, and wood. Manpower represents your available population that you can recruit into your armies.
Right, so the more people you have, the bigger your army can be.
Exactly. Horses are specifically for cavalry units, giving you that extra mobility on the battlefield.
Okay, so if you want a strong cavalry force, you need to make sure you have enough horses.
Then you have iron, which is used to make weapons and armor for your troops. Leather is primarily used for armor and support equipment, which we'll talk about more in a bit.
And I'm guessing wood is like a general purpose resource used for building and fuel and stuff.
Right. It's used as fuel for your workshops and also goes into some types of equipment.
So you need to make sure you have a steady supply of all these resources if you want to build a powerful empire.
Exactly. And the way you gather these resources is through your settlements. They extract these materials directly from the land you control.
And I imagine the type of terrain your settlements are on will affect how much of each resource you can produce.
You got it. And any improvements you build, like farms or mines, can further enhance your resource output.
So there's a real strategic element to where you place your settlement and how you develop the surrounding land.
Now, once you have those raw resources, you need to process them into equipment. That's where workshops come in. They're specialized buildings within your settlements that produce things like armor, weapons, and support equipment.
Support equipment. What's that?
Think of it as gear that enhances your army's capabilities. The exact types of support equipment are still being developed, but we know it can provide various bonuses to your troops in battle.
So it's not just about having the biggest army. It's also about equipping them properly to give them an edge.
And all this equipment, along with your manpower and horses, gets stored in a central location called the Global Equipment Stock, or GES. It's like your empire's main warehouse for all your military needs.
Yeah, so it's where everything comes together before it's distributed to your armies.
Precisely. And there are limits to how much you can store in the GES.
Oh, so you can't just hoard unlimited resources and equipment.
Well, you can go over the storage limits, but there's a hefty penalty for doing so. Excess resources degrade rapidly and you lose a big chunk of them.
Wow, that's a pretty harsh consequence.
Yeah, it really forces you to manage your resources carefully and plan your expansion strategically. You can't just grow without thinking about the consequences.
And that makes sense. It wouldn't be very realistic if you could just accumulate infinite resources without any downsides.
Right, and that's where outposts come in. There's specialized structures you can build to increase your storage capacity and boost your resource production.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. Barracks increase your storage capacity for manpower, horses, and equipment. Camps, which you build in forests or rough terrain, give you a bonus to leather production. Mines, built in hills or rough terrain, double your iron output. And warehouses significantly increase your storage capacity for equipment.
So choosing the right outpost for your territory can really make a difference in how efficiently you can manage your resources and support your armies.
Now let's shift gears and talk about armies and combat. How do you raise those legions and lead them to victory?
All right, let's get tactical. How do these armies work?
The number of armies you can have at any given time depends on how many settlements you control. You start with 3 armies, and you gain 1 more for every 2 settlements you have.
So the more territory you control, the bigger your potential army can be.
That's right. And each army has an organization value, which represents how prepared they are for battle. Engaging in combat lowers their organization, but you can order them to rest and recover over time.
So you can't just keep throwing your armies into battle after battle without giving them a chance to regroup and recover.
And your armies also gain experience as they fight, going from recruit to trained, experienced, veteran, and finally elite. These experience levels have a significant impact on how effectively they perform in combat.
So a veteran army will be much tougher to beat than a bunch of fresh recruits.
And in addition to troops and experience, there's also the concept of support equipment, which is consumed as your armies move and fight. This equipment can provide various bonuses, and its consumption affects the army's combat readiness.
So even if you have a highly experienced army, if they're running low on support equipment, they're not going to be as effective.
Exactly. It's all about keeping your armies well supplied and prepared for battle.
So what kind of troops can we actually recruit into these armies?
The game lists 7 general troop types: city guard, infantry, heavy infantry, marksmen, cavalry, heavy cavalry, and siege engines.
And I imagine each faction has its own unique variations of these troop types.
Absolutely. They might have different names, stats, and equipment, which will influence how you approach building and using your armies.
So some factions might be better at ranged combat, while others excel at close quarters fighting.
And when your armies inevitably suffer losses, you need to reinforce them. This is done by drawing manpower and equipment from that central global equipment stock we talked about earlier.
So it all comes back to managing your resources and making sure you have enough to support your military campaigns.
Now let's talk about what happens when those armies clash on the battlefield.
All right, let's break down the combat system. What determines who wins and who loses?
Well, there's a combat value, or CV, which is calculated based on the attack strength of your units and the defense strength of the enemy units. The side with the higher CV has an advantage in combat.
So it's not just about numbers, it's also about the quality of your troops and their equipment.
Exactly. And then there's initiative, which can determine who gets to attack first in a round of combat.
So having the initiative can give you a crucial early advantage.
And the size of your army matters as well. Having multiple armies participate in a battle can grant you a flanking bonus, which increases your combat effectiveness.
That's interesting. So it's not always best to just have one massive army. Sometimes it's better to have multiple smaller armies that can flank the enemy and gain an advantage.
And to counter that, there's a limit on overwhelming force, so one side can't just completely crush the other with sheer numbers.
So there's a balance there. You need to have enough troops to be effective, but you also need to think strategically about how you deploy them.
And if you're defending a settlement, city walls provide a significant bonus to your defending troops.
So fortifying your cities is important for defense.
And then there are siege engines, which are designed to break down those walls.
I imagine those are pretty powerful units.
They are, but they're also still being developed in the beta version of the game.
So there's more to come on that front.
And finally, there's the concept of army strategies. These are like general battle plans that you can choose for your armies, such as rushing the enemy, forming a shield wall, or focusing on archer fire.
And I'm guessing these strategies have strengths and weaknesses against each other.
You got it. Choosing the right strategy for the situation can be crucial for victory. And in battles with multiple armies, the largest army on each side often dictates the overall strategy.
So there's a real element of tactical decision-making both before and during battles.
And of course, a major objective in many battles is to capture enemy settlements. To do so, you need to defeat the defending garrison, and when you capture a city, you typically destroy some of its workshops and reduce the level of its walls.
It sounds like combat in Imperium Sine is quite nuanced, with a lot of factors to consider.
Now, let's circle back to diplomacy, which is all about interacting with those other factions in the game. How do you navigate those relationships?
All right, let's talk diplomacy. It sounds like it could be a pretty delicate dance.
As we mentioned earlier, there's a language barrier at the start of the game. You need to translate other factions' languages before you can really interact with them diplomatically.
So your first encounter with another faction might be a bit awkward, with lots of hand gestures and pointing.
And once you can communicate, you have a range of diplomatic actions available to you. You can declare friendship to improve relations, offer peace to end conflicts, open your borders to allow free movement of units, propose alliances for mutual support, and even send gifts as a gesture of goodwill.
So you have a lot of options for building positive relationships.
But it's not always that simple. Your diplomatic interactions are influenced by a whole bunch of relation modifiers.
Relation modifiers?
Yeah, they're factors that can positively or negatively affect your relationships with other factions.
Like what?
Well, there's border tension, which increases if you have cities close to another faction's borders. Broken treaties obviously damage relations. Capturing a city from another faction can really sour things between you.
So every action you take has consequences on the diplomatic landscape.
Exactly. And the behavior of the AI-controlled factions is influenced by their playstyle and personality, so some factions might be more aggressive, while others are more peaceful.
So you never quite know what to expect.
And that brings us back to the overall goal of the game, which is to build the largest and most powerful empire possible.
So world domination, basically?
In a sense, yes. But it's not just about brute force. You need to use a combination of economic development, technological advancement, military strategy, and diplomatic skill to achieve your goals.
It sounds like a real test of leadership.
It is. And it leads to some interesting questions for the listener. What do you think is the best path to victory in Imperium Sine? Is it through military conquest, economic dominance, diplomatic maneuvering, or a combination of all three?
And how do you deal with the unpredictable nature of the other factions?
Those are great questions to ponder. And if you're interested in learning more about the game, I encourage you to check out their Discord server. The link is in the show notes. It's a great place to connect with other players and delve deeper into the intricacies of Imperium Sine Fine.
It's a whole community of people who are passionate about the game.
So are you ready to forge your legacy and rule an empire without end?
The choice is yours. In Imperium Sine Fine, your destiny is in your hands.
That's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening.